Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we're releasing a special episode from a project that I undertook in 2022 called the Boundless Body Radio Premium Podcast. It was my intention to take all of the best clips about one particular topic from our show and put them together as a masterclass to be released behind a paywall with a subscription-based service on Patreon. Well, we didn't have many subscribers, so I'm breaking up these episodes and releasing them here for free so that they can make an impact and hopefully help some people out there. Today's episode was taken from the first series all about the 3 macronutrients. This is part 1 from the 3rd episode all about fat. We always appreciate any feedback that you might have, so feel free to leave us a comment on YouTube or on our website at myboundlessbody.com, where you can always book a complimentary 30-minute session with us at any time. Cheers and enjoy part 1 of this 2-part conversation all about fat. Hello, this is Casey Ruff, and welcome to the 3rd episode of the Boundless Body Radio Premium Podcast. Now, as you can imagine, the first 2 episodes that we did were about the first 2 macronutrients. We covered protein in the first episode, covered carbohydrates in the second episode, so this one will be the 3rd macronutrient, which is all about fat. We are going to be taking what I would consider an absolute flyby, 30,000-foot view of what is going on with fat, and that said, this episode is going to be well longer than 3 hours. I just decided that if we were going to deep dive into this topic, which is one of my favorites to learn about and really talk about, we had to do it in a way that presented what I would consider the whole picture. So just know that we're going to cover a lot of topics. There's going to be a lot of crossover between those topics, but I think this is the best way we could find to really tell this story. We will be taking a lot of the concepts that we talk about in this episode and creating all kinds of different spin-off premium episodes from this. So we'll be deep diving into heart disease. We'll be deep diving into cholesterol. We'll be deep diving into vegetable oils and polyunsaturated oils like seed oils. So all of that is to come, but we really felt strongly about getting this one out with this kind of view of everything that's going on and how crazy this story absolutely is. So I do have to say that unlike the carbohydrate episode, with this episode, I didn't include anybody's personal stories. Those have been told in all of these people's individual episodes that we did on Boundless Body Radio. So I highly encourage you to go check them out. But I will say, without exception, the people that made it onto this podcast have a very strong and interesting personal story related to what we are going to cover. I don't think you can go out into the world and say that carbohydrates are causing metabolic disease and that saturated fat in particular is not particularly bad for you without having a very strong conviction and a very strong knowledge base. And our guests certainly have that, and we've tried to tie these clips in a way that makes a lot of sense, and I'll try to interject as much as possible to provide context to this. And like I said, we'll be deep diving into more of these topics later on down the road, but we wanted to get this recorded and out to you on the way. Also, a little surprising to me that this is my entire life, finding this message basically about a decade ago and how it has really altered my life. This is what I do. This is my entire life, from waking up to the things that I study, to the podcasts that I listen to, all the books that I read, all the people that we interview on Boundless Body Radio. This has absolutely consumed my life. And that said, it was still so interesting to me and still so joyful to go back and listen to all these different episodes and compile them. I mean, I'm telling you, I did the interview, I did all the editing for the original interview, and now putting these together, I've listened to these clips probably 10 times each. And every time I do, I learn something new. So I really hope this is a valuable episode for you. We are going to start, like we have with the other 2, with some exclusive content. So we are going to hear initially from Krishna Hanks. Krishna Hanks is the owner of Square One Wellness, and she was hosted on our show on episode 304. So be sure to go check that out. And we are going to be asking her some basic questions to set up this conversation.
Dietary fat. It's a big question, right? And especially in a culture where we're told to fear fat of all kinds. And I think as a health coach, one of the biggest, let's say, hurdles you have to overcome with individuals, particularly females, it seems like, is to try to open the discussion about what is fat. So I think this is a fabulous conversation. Thank you for inviting me. So dietary fat, to me, and I'm approaching everything from the lens of a health coach, is fats that are present in foods, such as meat products, right? You have lower amounts in nuts, seeds, and some fruits like avocados and olives. And I'm particularly interested in those fats, those dietary fats that come from natural sources, just like I just mentioned. We can talk about other sources that come from what I call unnatural or processed sources, right? But fats are, an integral part of our diet. Let's say if you've got, and you can always listen to that beautiful TED Talk from Dr. Sarah Halbach, where she beautifully explains the three macronutrients, right? The fats, the protein, and the carbohydrates. And of those three macronutrients, we know, all right, it says in the literature that carbohydrates are really non-essential. So you've got two very essential ones, protein and fat. Now, on the types of fat, right, you've got three basic ones. And I'm not a biochemist, I'm a health coach, but you've got your saturated fat, your monosaturated fat, and your polyunsaturated fat. And those range in hierarchy, right, from most stable to least stable. And something that I find always fascinating in working with individuals, coaching individuals, is they maybe don't realize or just haven't investigated enough, but every fat has actually all three of those. It's just that they have one in more majority. So let's say in a piece of steak, you have got saturated fat, mono, and poly, but the saturated fat is the one of the majority, right? And when we think about the stability, so that's what I'm interested in these days also, is why are we having so many individuals with inflammation? So saturated fat is the most stable of those three, right? And that has to do with its structure. And if we think about the structure of fats, right, saturated being the most stable, right? You've got carbon bonds, and I love it in the book from Sally Fallon and the Weston A. Price on fats. They talk about that all the carbon bonds are occupied or they're saturated, right? So that's really, really stable in that. When you drop down in the hierarchy to the monosaturated, which is something like olive oil, right? And if we understand that saturated fats, usually they can be solid, right? That is their structure there. So olive oil is something like, it can get solid if you cool it, right, in the fridge, right? But it also is in a liquid form. It's missing two of those hydrogen atoms. So it has instead two carbon bonds, and it's that little bend which makes it a little less stable, right? And then we drop down one more into the hierarchy of the polyunsaturated, right, which has two or more bonds and therefore lacks four of the hydrogen. And it's this run which becomes, again, much less stable, right? And there are then we get into the conversation of the omega-6 and the omega-3 here. And it is important, and where we're seeing a lot of the research is the ratio of omega-6 and omega-3. We need both of them in the body, right? So if omega-6 is a little more inflammatory, and when you cut yourself, you're really glad you have that, right? Because it's going to help you with the healing process. But what we're seeing today, and we'll get to this conversation a little bit, is the polyunsaturated fats, right, from the vegetable oils, from what I call those unnaturally processed fats, right? The ratio is so much higher. I think in Sally Fallon's book, the Weston A. Price, they talk about a really more ideal ratio might be that 1-to-1 or maybe even 2 or 3-to-1. But what we're seeing today is ratios upwards of 20-to-1, right? Of that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So we're going into territory which I think we're not really made for in that way. And if we go back to that idea that we need protein and fat, I like to say, and when I'm looking at how I'm helping or supporting clients of mine, is the more you can get your dietary fat from these natural sources, the better, right? And when we think about recommendations, right, again, as a health coach, I'm looking to make people find a simple solution, not make them find, help them, support them find a simple solution. So when it comes to recommendations, right, particularly coming from a low carbohydrate lifestyle, we're looking at this whole picture. So first, we're going to start with like, what are your goals? What are you trying? Do you have weight loss goals? Do you have weight maintenance goals? Are you insulin resistance? What is the overarching goal? And then looking at what you're consuming. So we would start first with how many carbohydrates? What is your carbohydrate tolerance, right? What is the amount that is going to be ideal for where your goals are and what you're doing, your age, all those kind of things. And then second would be getting adequate protein, right? Finding the right source of protein for you, for your skeletal muscle mass, for your activity level, again, for your age, gender, all those things. And then we start saying, okay, well, now we figured out what those two pieces of the macronutrient situation are. And then we say, how do we fortify that? How do we fat fortify that? What is the amount of dietary fat? I'm usually not working with people in the terms of a percentage. You need to have a percentage. We start, again, as I just mentioned, with the carbohydrate intake, protein intake, and then the idea of fat fortifying your meals from natural sources, right? From those coming from meats, meat products, as I said, nuts, seeds, and some fruits in there. And I can tell you the sources of dietary fat that we have in our house, right, are duck fat, tallow, lard, homemade bacon grease, right, coconut oil, olive oil. The dietary fats we do not have in our house would be those polyunsaturated or PUVAs made from seed oils, which are highly processed, right? I think Chris Kresser breaks it down. He goes through the whole process of why are seed oils making us sick, right? It is this enormous processing of those oils. And as we start to see, right, those polyunsaturated made from highly processed factories, just not a natural product, we see all kinds of negative impacts, whether it's impacting our mitochondria in the cell, whether it's impacting ATP, our sort of power source, signaling failures in the cells, oxidation, inflammation. So my perspective on advice or just working with people to help understand dietary fat is real simple. Can you get your dietary fat from natural sources? And can you avoid those unnatural sources, those highly processed ones?
Wow, that was an amazing explanation. So if we understand it, we've got our saturated fat, which is really stable, which means it does really well when we heat it up. It does well if it sits out, like grandma always used to have the bacon grease sitting out on the stove. That's totally fine. I made some bacon for an upcoming backpacking trip that I'm going to do. And it was lovely to just tip the tray into a little jar and save all the grease. We did that yesterday and it's great. We use that for cooking. It's fantastic. So those natural saturated fats would be coming primarily from animals, could also be like coconut oil, the more solid fats. We have monounsaturated fats, which have that one double bond that can react with oxygen and create oxidation. So that would be olive oil. Maybe avocado is primarily kind of that monounsaturated fat. And you just need to be a little bit more careful with it, right? It will oxidize with light, heat, and air. So you just need to be careful. Then we have these polyunsaturated fats, which we do need. We just need them in tiny, tiny quantities. And we need them to be primarily omega-3, which is anti-inflammatory, dietary and less omega-6. And we need both. You're right. Like when we get cut, we need that inflammation. Inflammation is never a bad thing, but it can go haywire if we get way too much. And so once we started, incorporating more of these vegetable oils, which ironically don't even come from vegetables, not at all. They come from seeds and nuts and all these things that we squeeze this teeny tiny amount of fat from. They're not even high fat products. And that's where the unnatural fats come in. And those are the ones we want to avoid. Do I understand that right?
Totally. And again, if we think about it, you could squeeze an avocado or you could squeeze an olive. However, to get seed out of a soybean oil or corn oil, you're having to take this immense process of heating it numerous times, right? Of adding chemicals to change the color, and all those heavily processed things. And as you said, it's the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. It's not that we don't want them at all in our body, those polyunsaturated, but we need them in that good ratio, right, for the body. And I love your explanation of, we want those things that are stable, that the body responds very well to them. It seems that we're more designed for those dietary fats that are naturally made, as opposed to design for these heavily processed, heavily chemicaled products that seem to be playing havoc with so many processes in the body, right? And when we're like working with elements that we're not designed for, there's just too many things that can go wrong in a simple way.
Yeah, that's right. Wow. Well, what an amazing explanation. We're so glad we're starting off this episode with this explanation. We really appreciate that so much. Where can people go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm at square1wellness.com and the number one, that's my website. I'm also on Twitter with the same handle, square1wellness, and on Instagram. Love to hear from anyone. And thank you so much.
So a huge thank you to Krishna Hanks for that exclusive content that did not appear on any of our podcast episodes on Boundless Body Radio. That was something separate that we did just for this episode. So we really appreciated her insight. So the way we are going to try to tell this story is we are going to go back. We're going to go way, way, way back to the age of dinosaurs. Now, this will be very interesting. We're going to start with Dr. Mickey Bendor, who's a paleoarchaeologist. He knows a lot about human evolution. And it might seem a little strange we start off talking about dinosaurs and talking about large animals that this planet used to hold and no longer do. This is so important to understand the context of our evolution and the things that we were consuming. The idea that large animals were everywhere, that we as humans have a limitation on how much protein that we can consume, which is constrained at normally somewhere around 30 to 40%, meaning we have to get our energy either from carbohydrates or from fat. And that is really, really, really important to understand. And it's really important also to understand what Mickey is going to tell us about energetic return. How much energy do you get per calorie by pursuing either fat sources or carbohydrate sources? And I think a really nice example of this is if you've ever had a garden, you know how much work goes into that garden and how many calories you end up getting out of that, and especially if you average that out for an entire year. Those plants are very, very seasonal, and it would be very difficult to raise plants and have a garden that would provide you food and calories for the rest of your life. So let's get into this clip with Dr. Mickey Bendor.
First of all, let's understand that the planet can support many large animals. And you only have to go back 66 million years and think about the animals that were the dinosaurs, okay? They were huge animals. Now, the dinosaurs went extinct about 66, 65 million years ago. So the planet can support larger animals, but at that time, the largest mammal was few hundred grams. And it grew, and if you take the average weight of all the species, the mammals, terrestrial species, it grew from few hundred grams through 65 million years, basically in the same direction, because really they had it comes back to this equilibrium state of having many large animals. And at the end, at the top, it was like 2.5 million years ago. When we started our career as Homo, the average size of terrestrial animals was 500 kilos. 500 kilos is 1,100 pounds.
Wow.
This is the average. So you can imagine that there were many species of large animals, especially proboscideans, elephants of all kinds. There were at that time like 5 species of elephants in Africa and many other large animals, the name of which I don't remember, and I probably won't say anything to anybody here. So, but if you look at the sites, the archaeological sites of Homo erectus, you find these animals that are, well, for instance, the elephant at that time, one of the species, for example, called Elephas reki, weighed something like 12 tons. 12 tons.
Wow.
And today, an elephant weighs about 4 tons, 6 tons. So it was a huge, huge animal. And there were others, not, I think it was the largest. It was the largest one. But there were many animals, many species. And today, most of them are gone. There's only 1, 2, 3 species in Africa that have like over a ton. It's the elephant, rhino, and hippo.
Wow.
So really, the thing with these large animals is that they don't run away. So when you come to them, they usually don't run away. They may charge, so you better be careful, but they don't run away. So it's quite easy to catch them. You need a lot of courage to catch them, but it's still easy. You just dig a hole and you wait for them, and maybe you take 20 people and you try to push them to that hole, or maybe you just wait for them to go to the lake and fall into the hole. You cover the hole, the pit, like you cover with the branches or so. And then with a very simple wooden spear, you can kill them. So it's not a big, you don't need a big brain to do it.
Wow.
But when they start to disappear, you are left with the animals that do run away. Like, let's say, zebra. Yeah, if you get like in maybe, I don't know, 300 feet from a zebra, he will start to run away from you. Mm. So you have to develop tools, for instance, called projectile tools, that will chase him instead of you, because you can't get him. Also, you may have hit him, but you have to follow, because he doesn't die. And so you need to be very good at tracking animals. Mm. And for that, you need the large brain. Mm. So this is the theory, more or less.
That's super interesting. So basically, we overhunted all of those large animals. Is that correct?
Probably. It's very difficult to prove, but we are getting there. For instance, this is a paper that's going to be published, hopefully in a few months. We took all the archaeological sites in near Israel. So it's called the area is called the Levant. That's Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Sinai, probably Sinai Desert. And we took all the archaeological sites over 1.5 million years. So we have like over 100 layers. And we took all the animals and we did the statistics. And we saw that they decline with time. But there's no association whatsoever with the climate. So if it's not the climate, it's very likely that it's the humans that caused it. Mm. So this is our assumption. This is our hypothesis. Yes.
Interesting.
Humans did it. Well, we are not the only one with that hypothesis. There are quite a few that it's not accepted by everybody, but I think data is coming out and showing that humans were the main culprit in eliminating large animals. Mm. Large animals give a very high energetic return for the investment of getting them. And also, most important or very important is that they have large fat content, relatively speaking, in other words, in percentage terms. So, and we are limited in the amount of protein that we can consume, humans. Not lions and not wolves, but humans are limited in the amount of protein that they can consume to about 40% of the calories. So we need 60% to get from the fat or maybe from plants. But to get plants, it's a very low energetic return. Just to give you some numbers, in today's condition, the energetic return of 1 hour work, the average for plants is about 1,400 calories. And the average for a medium-sized animal is 50,000 calories. So it's really no competition. So it's always better to get animals than plants. And if you have to get animals, you're stuck. You need a lot of fat, because you cannot get more than 40% of your energy from the protein. Mm. So this is important in large animals.
Next, we are going to be hearing from Amber O'Hearn. Amber has been in the carnivore world eating a meat-only diet for over a decade now. She is somebody who is very, very smart, very articulate. She does a lot of research, and she appears on stages all over the world to explain some of her research, which is really amazing. We've been fortunate enough to host her twice on our show. So she is going to say a few things that are going to confirm what we just heard from Dr. Mickey Bendor. She's also going to bring up concepts like fasting and ketosis, which for now, you don't need to worry too much about. We're going to get into that in greater detail later. I just wanted to include this here because of the way that she's confirming some of the things that Dr. Mickey Bendor was saying, and brings up things like the expensive tissue hypothesis.
The role of fat in the human diet, I think, has just been completely ignored, in part because of the blinders that we have now from civilization as we currently have it, being based on grain agriculture. And in fact, I see this as thematic, that a high carb diet is considered the default, in part because even the advent of writing and medicine as we know it today happened after grain agriculture. And so the whole idea of ketosis being related to, or being fasting mimicking, for example, comes from the baseline diet being anti-ketogenic. But if our baseline diet didn't include all this high carb and grain, we never would have compared a ketogenic diet to fasting, because our diet would have already been ketogenic. And before the advent of grain agriculture, and well, I don't want to make it sound like it was this sudden no grain to grain based. It was a very gradual and long process, but there was a time where most of our calories appear to have come from actually fat from animals, which is really ironic given how demonized animal fat is now. But back before we were even Homo sapiens, we have this long line of Homo and Australopithecus before Homo, after we split from chimps. And that whole few million years where both of those species were differentiating. And one of the first things, well, I mean, if you look at a chimp and a human, there are some very obvious differences that stand out, even though we're obviously also have a lot of similarities. But the large brain is probably the one that we like the most. But we also have much smaller guts, and those are almost certainly related. There's a hypothesis called the expensive tissue hypothesis, which it says that the brain tissue is a very expensive tissue. It takes a lot of energy to maintain. 20% of an adult's energy is going to just what's in your head, which is really pretty amazing. Whereas intestinal tissue is also very expensive. And so the idea is that we needed to, or put it this way, when the pressure came off using intestinal tissue, insofar as we could give up intestinal tissue, we would have extra energy that would be available to be used to expand the brain tissue. And that's certainly what it looks like when you compare the intestines of a chimp or a gorilla or other primates that are close to us. We have much more small intestines proportionately, and we have given up our most of, relative to chimpanzee, most of our colons. And the function of the colon is to ferment fiber in order to give calories. Fiber is not digestible by any vertebrate, but it's digestible by microbes. And so herbivores, and to a lesser extent omnivores, have this ability, a symbiotic setup where their colons are providing a place for fiber to be turned into fat for energy. And we gave up a lot of that, and we're kind of locked into the situation where we can no longer get as much energy out of fiber as where we presumably evolved from. And the reason that scientists think that we did give that trade-off was so that we could have bigger brains. And the process of that brain expansion started way back in Australopithecus times. The first brain expansion that is shown by skull remains is associated with when Australopithecus started not hunting, but actually scavenging after large carnivores and getting what's left over after the carnivore is there. And that is the inside bone nutrition from marrow and from skulls that is very nutrient dense and very energy dense. And so this dependence or making use of animal fat is, I think, an integral part of the whole human experience from millions of years before we were even humans the way that we are today.
Next, we're going to be hearing from Dave Champion. He's the author of Body Science. This is going to really set up the conversation as we proceed on two major inflection points on our evolution. So we heard from Amber, we heard from Mickey about how we evolved for a great majority of our time on this planet being Homo sapiens. We're going to go to two specific events that happened 12,000 years ago and more recently within the last basically like 200 years. I can't recommend Dave Champion's work enough. Go back to Boundless Body Radio on episode 121 to hear the conversation we had with him, and I would absolutely pick up his book, Body Science. It really changed the way I thought about how cholesterol works in the body and fat and carbohydrates, which he calls the carbohydrate using system, more of our energy system, and terms it glucosis, which you'll hear that term a few times here. So let's go to Dave. There were a few really, really important events that happened, one about 12, maybe 15,000 years ago. Can you talk about what happened that started us down this path of running that emergency system all the time?
Yes, it is called the first agricultural revolution. And essentially, that we can simplify that and say humans learn how to cultivate, how to farm. And virtually anything that grows out of the ground, a plant, is carbohydrates. Okay? So about 12,000 years ago, the trajectory of what we ate began to change. As you can imagine, if I say it started 11,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago, the change was very minor. And with time and learning more how to cultivate, how to farm, the percentage of carbohydrates in the human diet gradually increased. Now, we get into about the 19th century, and this is where things change dramatically. That is the second agricultural revolution. And this was, I get that the British thought that they were doing a great thing when they learned how to exponentially increase crop yields. They didn't understand what they were really doing, what the consequence was. Nobody understood back then because we didn't have the science. And it had happened so gradually that the change in human physiology was unnoticed generation to generation. And then, of course, then we have the beginning of the 20th century and what I have dubbed the third revolution of bringing carbohydrates to the table. That is where science started taking things that were grown, taking them into a laboratory, creating things never before known to humankind, and saying, look what we did. We processed this, and now it's even better than it ever was. And perhaps for the taste buds, that might be true, but physiologically, it took the damage to a stratospherically new level, which is why, if we go back before the 20th century, say to the late 1800s, heart attacks were virtually unknown. And doctors had to travel many, many, many states away, which was arduous back then, right? They had to travel just to take a class about this weird thing called diabetes, because most doctors had never met anyone with diabetes, no less had a patient who was diabetic. So they had to travel to go to these classes to completely, it wasn't even taught in medical school. They had to go to these classes because that was the only way to get the information. That tells you how incredibly rare, if there was no heart attack, almost no heart attacks, heart disease was incredibly rare. Diabetes was virtually unknown. And so then we transit into the 20th century with this industrial produced food, where they take what grows out of the ground and then they process it. And all of a sudden, this eventually, by the time we get to the 1940s and 50s, we have this epidemic that Ansel Keys was supposed to address. So you see the timeline all the way from 12,000 years ago to Ansel Keys and his corrupt research, resulting in America adopting the completely wrong, inaccurate dynamic.
You mentioned processed foods. I'm thinking of three in particular that stand out as probably the most damaging. The first you mentioned, which is grains. When we increased our yields of grains, that was inherently a very bad thing. Second thing I would think of would be the refinement of table sugar. We learned how to get it from beets. Is that correct?
Sugar beets and sugar cane.
Okay.
For instance, Alexander Hamilton was born on a small Caribbean island where they had slaves producing sugarcane.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so those are the two. The third I'm thinking of right around, the beginning of the 20th century would be vegetable oils. Crisco in 1911, first hydrogenated fat that came from cottonseed. Would that be the third highest offender in your opinion?
Yes. Vegetable oil has been the scourge of modern, we'll say post-World War II, just to give it a finite time frame. It has been the scourge of public health, and not so much the obesity. That's more the other starchy, grainy processed foods. It has been the scourge of the public's health in terms of cancer. Science has known since the 1970s that a diet heavy in vegetable oil produces a 300% increased risk for colorectal cancer and a 200% increased risk of cancer, all cancers across the board. And yet, knowing that as early as the 1970s, in the 1980s, the United States government said, Ansel Keys says saturated fat will give you heart disease. So eat this, we all know this phrase, right? Healthy fats. Now, also, I think an important thing for people to realize is the term vegetable oil is one of the biggest scams in modern consumer history.
Thank you.
With the exception, perhaps, of things like avocado oil or olive oil, that's not vegetable oil at all. When you walk down the aisle at Walmart, I actually did a video about this one time where I filmed this, like, I don't know what it was, like 25 feet of a 7-high-foot rack filled with stuff saying vegetable oil on the label. Okay. And not a drop of it is from vegetables. It is oil industrially removed from nuts and seeds and grains.
Next, we are going to go to a clip from Dr. Chris Kenobi, who is actually an ophthalmologist, which you might be thinking, what is an eye doctor doing in a discussion about fat? But very interestingly, a lot of his work has been studying macular degeneration, and he has uncovered through his research a lot of very interesting findings about the types of fats that we're consuming and how they impact specifically the eyes, but the whole body. So he does a really great job in this clip talking more about our history and especially the history of disease. So let's go now to Dr. Chris Kenobi.
Heart disease in the 19th century, coronary heart disease, was an extraordinary rarity. In fact, there was 8 scientific papers on heart disease in the entire century, and they knew what it was. In fact, there was 2 cases, 2 of those papers that reviewed embolic myocardial infarction, which is the equivalent of heart attack. And in fact, in the famed physician, Sir William Osler, probably the most famous physician between the late 19th century and about maybe 1940, I think. He published a paper in 1897. He'd reviewed his previous 21 years of hospital experience. This is an example of what's so incredible about that era. 21 years, he had never seen a heart attack. Wow. He witnessed about 6 cases of angina, the chest pain, consistent with coronary artery type heart disease. And then that was 1897. And 13 years later, in 1910, he was actually now he was practicing in London, England, and he presented to an audience there. And he noted that in those 13 years, he had witnessed an additional 208 cases of angina. But to the best of my ability to tell from his writings, he had not witnessed a heart attack.
Wow.
And in fact, really almost nobody had. John Herrick, or maybe it was James Herrick, I can't remember. But anyway, Herrick, 1912, published the first known myocardial infarction heart attack in the United States, 1912. And yet by the 1930s, heart disease was the leading cause of death in the United States. So it really went from, like, in 1905, nobody even knew what a heart attack was. It's really almost no one had ever witnessed one. And by the 1930s was the leading cause of death. And of course, now today, heart disease kills about 1 out of every 3 people. It's around 32% or so. So cancer, for example, in the town of Boston in 1811, cancer took the lives of 5 of 942 people that died. That's 1 in 188 people. All right. By 1900, cancer was killing 1 in 17 people in the United States. And today, in 2010, cancer kills, I think it's 31.1% of people. So again, it's almost 1 in 3. And it's the same situation, type 2 diabetes. In fact, diabetes of any type was virtually unknown in the 19th century. It was an extraordinary rarity, right? And it was 0.37% in 1935, diabetes. This continued to rise. It rose 2.5-fold by 1960, 8-fold by 1990, 19-fold by 2010, and 25-fold by 2015. We were up to 9.4% by 2015. Today we're at 10.5% though. So I think we're like around whatever that is. It's something like almost 30-fold increase since 1935. And obesity, 19th century, 1.2% obesity in men age 18 to 80.
Wow.
You know, why 1.2%? You know, we think we were incredibly lean in 1960 when obesity in the United States was 13%. Well, it had risen 11-fold. And this trend continued, 23% by 1988, 35.7%, I think it was, by 2011, and 39.8% by 2015. We are on target to be 50% obesity in the United States in 2030, in about 9 years. 50% of all adults.
Wow.
So obesity, again, has already risen 33-fold in about 115 years. Same situation with macular degeneration. It was an extraordinary medical rarity between 1851 and 1930. By the 1970s, it was 8.8% of Americans over age 52, 27.9% of people over the age of 75. So again, almost 1 in 3 people over the age of 75 or 80. So, you know, that's what, and it's the same scenario. I won't try to go into it, but it's the same scenario with Alzheimer's disease and probably Parkinson's. And there's just so much other disease, you know, we could talk about that. You know, if you dig into the details, you start finding that these were all medical rarities. Why? Well, at the same time, what happened so back to the seed oils is, first of all, the world had no processed foods before the American Civil War, with the exception of sugar in small quantities. And so right after the American Civil War, manufacturers introduced seed oils into the food supply. And before that, seed oils were the only one they had was in the United States, or almost anywhere in the world, was cottonseed. Well, it came out of the United States. No, almost nobody in the world in 1865 had any form of vegetable oil, right? They did not exist. And there was some tropical oils. There was olive oil in really small quantities. And there were some tropical oils like coconut oil in certain populations. But the world had never seen these vegetable oils, which are oils like cottonseed, so soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, and peanut oils. All those oils, the world had never seen them.
So I thought that was a really interesting clip there and important to include. I think it was interesting that Dave didn't blame a lot of the obesity problem on the omega-6 fats, where Chris kind of mentioned it. You're going to hear it from our next guest, and also our former guest, Tucker Goodrich, also believes strongly that seed oils in particular, vegetable oils that we introduced into the diet very recently, are direct contributors to obesity as well. So I think all of those are valid points and really interesting to consider. We are now going to go to Nina Teicholz. If you have been in the low carbohydrate space for any amount of time, you surely will have come across the work of Nina Teicholz. If not, get ready to get blown away. Nina was a journalist who was asked to do an article about trans fats, and what she uncovered led to a 10-year process of writing her amazing book, Big Fat Surprise, which is all about the history of why we think saturated fat in particular is bad for us. She did such an amazing job researching this book and telling this story, which The Economist called a nutritional thriller, which I absolutely agree with. You cannot put this thing down, whether you are really interested in nutrition or not. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you clearly are. But we're going to talk about this problem that's now emerging, which I hope you can start to see what's going on. When we started to change our food through evolution into new things, new problems started to emerge. So we're going to hear from Nina a few times in this interview, and we are now going to introduce you to Dr. Ansel Keys. There's so many points in your book to try to jump in, and I just want to highlight a few things. And it's hard to decide, do we start 70 years ago? Do we start 110 years ago? Do we start 3 million years ago? Like, where do we jump in? And I guess I would like to jump in with President Eisenhower in 1955 having a heart attack. Can you kind of tell that story and how that evolved?
Yes. So this is sort of the origin story of how we all came to believe that saturated fat is bad for health. And that is that in the 1950s, the nation was in a real panic over heart disease. It had been virtually non-existent in the early 1900s, even though it had been diagnosed and was in medical textbooks. So doctors knew what it was, but there were very few cases. It rose to be the number one killer in the US by the 1950s. And in 1955, President Eisenhower has a heart attack, and he's out of the Oval Office for 10 full days. Just imagine the attention focused on him. We just had President Trump in the hospital for a couple days over COVID. I'm not sure if President Eisenhower was giving news conferences from the hospital, but the whole nation was completely focused on his health. And at the time, there were numerous theories about what might cause heart disease. No one was really sure. There was a theory that it could be vitamin deficiency, which I think is still plausible in part. There was a theory that it was caused by the rising tide of auto exhaust in the air, more cars on the road. There was a theory that it was a type A personality, people running around yelling at other people and being too aggressive and then just falling down and dying of a heart attack. But I think, as many people know, there was one theory that prevailed, and that was the one proposed by Ansel Keys, who was a physiologist from the University of Minnesota. And he said that it was saturated fat and cholesterol, that those that you find in dairy and meat and eggs, shellfish, high in cholesterol, organ meats, saturated fat and cholesterol would cause your blood cholesterol to go up, and that would sort of clog your arteries. The image was of cholesterol gradually accumulating in your arteries to eventually just clog them off, like hot oil down a cold drain pipe, and that would cause a heart attack and you would die. So that was the diet heart hypothesis. And Ansel Keys, he was a very persuasive individual. I mean, he had previously somehow managed to maneuver up the military chain of command to get K rations, those meals that are eaten by those who serve in the military. The K was named after Keys. And I still don't understand how he managed to sort of pull the levers of power to enable that to happen. But he also befriended President Eisenhower's doctor, Paul Dudley White, and took him on a trip around Europe and was able to persuade Eisenhower's doctor of his idea, such that Eisenhower was then put on a diet of margarine and dry Melba toast, not to mention the fact that he was something like a 4-pack a day smoker. But he suffered several more heart attacks before ultimately dying. But Ansel Keys was also was able to persuade the American Heart Association to name him as one of just a few people, maybe 6 or 7, on their highly influential nutrition committee. And that committee had really said, we don't have enough data to say what people should eat in order to avoid heart attacks. But as soon as Ansel Keys was added to the committee, he sort of elbowed them around to his point of view. And in 1961, he was able to get them to issue the first ever official advice telling people to cut back on saturated fat and cholesterol as the most important measure of prevention against heart disease. That's really where it all began. It was the American Heart Association responding to this intense the sense of urgency, with Ansel Keys sort of driving it from behind, issuing this kind of premature, preliminary advice that then became enshrined throughout all of the public health system. It was adopted by the National Institutes of Health. It really just became the dominant hypothesis, and it was accepted by everybody.
Mm. Well, he had this amazing study that he did. I remember seeing there was a very clear plot line with all these different countries. And the more saturated fat a country ate, the more they would die of heart disease. That's pretty clear. I mean, that's pretty good data, is it not?
So the 7-country study, well, for one thing, it was only men, even though it was extrapolated to be meaningful for both men and women. There were just a number of problems with this study. It's one of the studies that I spent probably 6 months tracking down every last publication regarding this study, including one that had been published in German in this out-of-the-way little journal with all the dietary data that he obviously did not want to be widely known. One of the things that I found from that publication was that he had used different ways of collecting the data so that none of his data were completely inconsistent. Like he sent some food samples back to Minnesota to be analyzed. Imagine that in the late 1950s, sending back food from Greece, an island in Greece, back to Minnesota, and other. He had also, for some of the men, he had used dietary recall data, which is a very bad way of collecting data because people don't remember what they eat. And even he acknowledged that, and he basically threw out all his dietary surveys at the end. So, and ultimately, he only sampled the dietary data of some 500 men in a sample of nearly 13,000. So that is not a statistically representative sample. He also had problems that the correlation that he found between saturated fat and heart disease didn't hold up inside countries. So that the people on the island of Corfu in Greece ate less saturated fat than the islanders on Crete. Yet on Corfu, they died. So they were better in terms of eating less saturated fat, but they died at higher rates from heart disease. Well, how could that possibly prove his theory? And so what he did is he tended to merge all the data in the countries and sort of ignore these problems that he found inside countries. He had the same problem in Finland, where the northern Finnish loggers who ate a lot more saturated fat were in fact found to be healthier than those in another part of Finland where they didn't eat as much saturated fat. So his data was not consistent, and he was able to get the results that he did by ignoring these inconsistencies. But I think ultimately the critique that is made of the 7 country study, regardless of what he found, is that it's an association. It's not causation. There's a huge difference between data that one is associated with something else. I mean, there's so many associations you can find. You can find an association between autism and the consumption of organic food, a perfect association between those two things. You can find a perfect association between consumption of margarine and the divorce rate in Maine. But is one of those things causing the other thing? That is where you need a randomized controlled clinical trial. That is the gold standard of science. And so the 7 country study was ultimately hobbled by the fact that it was just an association. And by the way, when I examined his data, and later on, I found that the stronger association was actually not between saturated fats and heart disease mortality or heart attacks. It was actually sugar, or sugary desserts, I think was the category. That was more strongly associated with poor outcomes from heart disease. And this was something that they just ignored. And I talked to one of his co-authors, who I think is still alive, Dr. Kromhout in the Netherlands. And I said, well, why did you not talk about sugar? And his response to me was, well, Ansel Keys was just so very sure that the culprit was saturated fat that, we did talk about sugar, but he put that aside.
So I hope by this point you're starting to see what an absolute disaster this is turning into, and how all of these events and ideas have kind of converged into this idea that fat is bad for us and that carbohydrates are free for us to eat at any percentage. And so I want to start this section and kind of like recap what's happened. I want to start with a passage in Nina Teichel's book, The Big Fat Surprise. So here she's talking about Ansel Keys' idea, which again is called the diet heart hypothesis. The idea that if you eat saturated fat, you will have more cholesterol in your body, and more cholesterol causes heart disease. And none of that is true. None of that has ever been proven to be true. But I want to read a passage from her book all about this idea. All of the ailments that have been ascribed to eating fat over the years, not just heart disease, but also obesity, cancer, diabetes, and more, stem from the implementation of this idea in the nutrition establishment by Ansel Keys and his perseverance in promoting it. Now, as you eat a salad with a lean chicken breast for lunch and choose pasta over steak for dinner, those choices can be traced back to him. The influence of Keys on the world of nutrition has been unparalleled. I just want you to think about that and think about your food choices that you have made over the years. And likely most of those choices have been heavily influenced by this one guy. So we go back to our evolution. As human beings, we had to get our calories partially from protein as a rebuilding, macronutrient, but we also need energy. So energy we can get in the form of carbohydrates or fat. As Mickey Bendor pointed out to us, fat was a much better energetic return, and fat and protein was available together by hunting animals, and that would be year round, where fruit would be much more seasonal, and it's not the kind of fruit and grains and things that we're used to seeing in the grocery stores today. Those have all been massively changed. The grains are totally different than what they used to be. Fruits are totally different than what they used to be, since we breed these things for the things that we like, which is like more sugar and things like that. So most fruits you wouldn't even like really recognize if you go back, even a few hundred years. So we evolved by eating fat and protein together. Then about 12,000 years ago, we decide to start agriculture. And so this is the minor shift that Dave Champion was talking about. So we start to settle down. We stop getting as many of our calories from animals, and we start to cultivate grains for we don't exactly know what reason, but that really shifts us and starts civilization. And at this point, we start to see our brain sizes, which have been increasing, now start to shrink. So now they're getting smaller. We know from the skeleton records that we start to get shorter. We're definitely like more malnourished when we go down this path, but this path that's way more gradual, as it was pointed out by Amber O'Hearn. Then we jump up to the Industrial Revolution about 200 years ago, when we figure out how to refine sugar. So sugar that was really inaccessible for most people, or very expensive or difficult to get to, now becomes cheap and easy to distribute. So we start to increase our sugar consumption. And then right around the turn of the century, we start to increase the amount of seed oils that we're consuming. So these are those vegetable oils. These are unnatural oils that are pressed from seeds and nuts that we talked to earlier today with Krishna Hanks. We covered that. So all of these things are changing. And now all the diseases that Dr. Chris Kenobi was talking about that were exceedingly rare, like heart disease, chronic diseases, diabetes, things like that, they all start to rise. And it causes this total panic in the country, and we don't have any easy answers. And so rather than blame all of these new foods and new ways of living, we blame saturated fat, because Ansel Keys is finding cholesterol inside of arteries and blaming the cholesterol and saturated fat for causing heart disease. And the country, again, very hungry for answers, is more than willing to say, yes, this is great. Let's go down this path. The American Heart Association gets on board. So they start promoting this type of a diet. So a very low saturated fat, high carbohydrate type diet. And now we see that obesity is starting to increase. That was never a thing even back in the 1950s. That was exceedingly rare. That all starts to increase. We start to get into the 1970s and 1980s, and now the government is getting involved, and they are making our nutritional recommendations, which are also not based on science. They're not based on any good evidence. In fact, Nina's current work, what she's doing now, is working with what she created called the Nutrition Coalition. And her mission is only to make sure, we're going to highlight this in the next video or the next audio clip. Her mission is to make sure that the nutritional guidelines are based on science. That's such a ridiculous thing to say, but that's where we are currently with our nutritional recommendations. They are not based on science. We are going to cite a stat later on in this episode with Ben Azadi, where he's going to say that only 12% of Americans are considered metabolically healthy. That's referring to a study that was done in 2016. And since Ben and I talked in that interview, a new study has come out with more recent data that is now showing that as of 2018, only 7% of Americans are considered metabolically healthy. And I would make a strong case to say that was before the pandemic, and I don't think very many people have been going the right direction since. All of this can be traced to this idea that changing the diet of every man, woman, and child in the country to this type of a diet, a low-fat, low-saturated fat diet, has caused all of these other things to increase. It's absolutely mind-boggling, the number of people that this affects and impacts. Surely you know of people who are diabetic, obese, they have dementia and Alzheimer's, and all of this can be linked back to this one idea, this one guy, Dr. Ansel Keys, who is promoting what he considers the absolute best thing for health as far as diet goes. We're going to go back to Nina to a later interview that we did. We talked to her a year later, and we're going to dive into what actually happens when we start to sub out the saturated fat for the other types of fats, including vegetable oil. why are we avoiding dietary fat? And the one that goes right along with it is that a good idea?
Why are we avoiding dietary fat? Well, I think it's important to say we started avoiding saturated fat first, right? And people get confused about this, but Ansel Keys, who many people know, who developed a theory that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol cause heart disease, that all started really with the American Heart Association's official recommendation to adopt Ansel Keys' advice in 1961. Okay, so this advice goes back now 60 years. But it wasn't until, Ansel Keys was not against the total amount of fat in the diet. He had kind of toyed with that idea early on in his career, but he dropped it and decided to focus on saturated fat. So he wasn't against a diet that would have been normal in fat, and the best statistics we have on this is the diet was about 40% fat in America when he was doing his work. So what changed and made us fear fat altogether is that in 1970, the American Heart Association, based on zero data, decided to adopt an overall low-fat diet, so bringing down fat altogether. And this was based on the idea, just an idea, never tested, that we should avoid fat because fat was more dense in calories, right? You eat, all the food that you eat is made up of 3 macronutrients: fat, protein, and carbohydrate. So protein and carbohydrate are 4 to 5 calories per gram. Fat is 9 calories per gram. And it was just at that point, the obesity crisis had really not begun, but it had just begun to creep up. And so as kind of a measure of precaution, the American Heart Association said we should just start reducing fat altogether. And that was how the low-fat diet started in 1970. And then what really sealed the deal was that the U.S. dietary guidelines adopted the whole American Heart Association platform, and that started in 1980. So now the whole nation is really swinging over to a low-fat diet. All cattle are bred to be lean. Everybody's all that phenomenon, all the manufactured goods that took the fat out. When you take the fat out, you replace it with, because fat is what conveys texture and flavor and allows a food to taste good, but it had to be replaced by, usually it was just carbohydrate, some kind of carbohydrate. So we got like the low-fat snack well phenomenon, and there was this whole tip away from fat and to filling it in with carbohydrates. Also, if you're avoiding food like fatty foods, or if you're, foods that are higher in fat, like regular fat dairy, right? Or you're switched to low fat milk or something, that it's the fat combined with the protein that is satiating, that actually fills you up. So if you are not satiated, you're eating meals that all of a sudden have you hungry, soon afterwards. And people start to eat more, and they're replacing the fat with carbohydrates. This is such a bizarre story because, when we got to like the 1980s was sort of the height of the non-fat diet, no fat at all. People like me growing up, in this era, we are, no fat, and there's salad dressing. You're trying to convince yourself that you could just have vinegar on your salad and that's fine. And skinless chicken breasts and, whatever crazy stuff we did. And we convinced ourselves that this tasteless, awful food was, desirable. Rice cakes for dinner. So the first ever clinical trial actually looking at the low-fat diet were some trials funded by the National Institutes of Health, NIH, that were done in Seattle on Boeing employees. Those were done in I think it's the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. Sorry, I don't remember the dates, but those studies show that people did not get any healthier and did not lose weight on a low-fat diet. So those studies were what we call silent studies. Nobody quoted them. Nobody referred to them. They weren't included in any review papers. They were just dropped. And actually, I talked to the lead investigator for my book. He's no longer alive, but he talked about the reaction to these papers, just like there was nothing. It was like they didn't exist in the field. And that is often the story of nutrition science, just as a little tangent here, which is that inconvenient findings are just contradictory findings are just ignored. But then they started the Women's Health Initiative study in 1996. That was on nearly 50,000 women. That lasted 7 years. And that study, many people think that the intervention group and the control group ended up looking too much alike to actually have that be a test of the low-fat diet. But it was intended to test the low-fat diet. The women in that study all just got a copy of the dietary guidelines and were told, follow them. So, and at the end of that, there were absolutely zero positive results. Or in the sense that the diet could not be shown to have helped anybody avoid any kind of disease, not any kind of cancer for which the trial had been actually powered, which is unusual, not heart disease, not diabetes, not obesity. So at that point, you can see in like the expert documents in the dietary guidelines, you can see them saying things like, oh, we can see that low-fat diet causes hypertriglyceridemia. I'm not sure if I've got that word right, but it's basically saying the low-fat diet is increasing your risk of heart disease, and which is true. When you go on a low-fat diet, your triglycerides tend to rise because you're increasing carbohydrates, and your HDL goes down. And this is in these expert documents, buried in there. And then there's another quote that I found where they say, we should be wary about adopting a low-fat diet because it'll tend to make people increase carbohydrates, and that could lead to obesity, which is exactly what happened. And I will just say, for people watching who are thinking, wait, we didn't actually reduce fat from 1980 to today, or 1970 to today, and that is not true. The low-fat diet has always been measured as not as a percent of total calories. So in terms of percentages, the amount of fat and the portion of fat in the diet has gone down dramatically. So I'm not going to remember the statistic, but it's like 25% or so. It's been a huge drop. And that's largely because, so people are right when they say we haven't changed the total amount of fat we've eaten. That's true. But we, as a population, eat about 275 more calories per person. So, and all those calories are carbohydrates, all of them. So as a portion of our total caloric intake, fat has decreased. So these rumblings in the expert documents about our national policy on fat, and the same things going on in the American Heart Association, because those two documents, the two leading nutrition policies in the country, they're very closely tied together. All the experts on both those boards, they're very much always in line with each other. They're starting to think, oh, we got it wrong on the low-fat diet. So they start actually as early as like 1995 or 2000 in the dietary guidance, they just drop any reference to low fat. If you go on their website, and if you go on the American Heart Association website, you cannot find the words low fat. They are no longer endorsing the low-fat diet. That is not there. And they are trying desperately to kind of move away from that position. But, we still kind of de facto have a low-fat recommendation because, or at least as you and I would understand a low-fat diet, because, our official guidelines, and this is reflected in school lunches, programs, food for the military, cafeteria food, all the institutional food out there that almost all of it follows the guidelines or is literally must follow the guidelines, like in the case of school lunches. The fat content of the meal cannot be above 35%.
Wow.
Which is, the definition of low fat has kind of varied in the scientific literature, but it's been between 20, 25, 30, 35%. That's a low fat diet. So it's just been it became dogma based on no science, and now we can't really back out of it.
Yeah, I don't remember them.
It's the story.
Yeah, I don't remember them releasing a press release or anything saying, hey, we're going to back away from these guidelines. It just gets buried in a report that it's nothing. They don't mention it. They don't say anything.
Well, see, that's exactly the point, right? So you can dig into the report and find the chair of the Dietary Guideline Committee saying, there is no there's no advice for a low-fat diet anymore. And you're like, what? What, where is the press release? Where is the huge multi-million-dollar information campaign, letting America know that this is not good advice and that it's no longer our advice? And why? Because they found that it increased the risk of heart disease.
Wow.
So, I mean, by the way, it also increases the risk of obesity because people shift their diet over to grains and sugars instead. But thus diabetes as well. But there has been there's no announcement about the shift, and it really is a tragedy because most people continue to think that cutting out fat is good for their health. They fear fat, not too much salad dressing, not too much sauce, definitely no cream, and I think that's still what the widely held belief.
Yeah. Wow. And that's only if you're willing to read those nutritional guidelines. I don't think The Economist called the nutritional guidelines a nutritional thriller.
A nutrition thriller.
Not so much. It's pretty dry. You have to be really interested in this stuff to appreciate it.
Yeah, you have to kind of like be a masochist. I mean, I have read them all, but I mean, it's so incredibly tedious. But it doesn't matter. Even if you don't read them, even if you don't read them, they reach you. Like your kids are going to school and getting school meals. Your elderly loved one in a nursing home is getting food based on the guidelines. Your if you know somebody in the military, their mess hall food and what they're instructed to eat, what's good and bad is based on the guidelines. There's just so many instances like that where people, basically captive populations, even if your doctor, your nurse, your dietitian, your nutritionist, all those people, their professional societies, they consider the guidelines the gold standard. So they teach the guidelines.
Yeah. Wow. That's why, I mean, we talked about this in our first episode. It's like, if I decide that I don't want to follow the guidelines because I've read your book, I've been in this world for many years, like that's fine for me, but it still has lots of implications that may or may not impact me directly, but it has impact all over. And that's why these guidelines are so critical and definitely need to be changed. And it's so bizarre. It's just like we read in the intro. All you're asking to do is have guidelines that are based on sound science. I was trying to think of like a parallel to this. Like, do we have a coalition that makes sure that all planes that fly commercially with hundreds of people are based on sound, aerodynamic principles that actually fly correctly? Like, I don't know if that's overly simplistic, but it seems like houses need to be built on sound principles of building construction. Like those, we don't need those. That's like common sense, yet we need that in nutrition. It's so bizarre.
Well, I mean, it's, if a plane is not built correctly, because it crashes. And if a house falls down or a bridge falls down, there's an investigation into why that happened. The problem with chronic disease is that it happens over the course of many, many years, and there are many places to point the finger of blame. And what to me is really upsetting, and this is something Dr. Sarah Halbert talked about in her TED Talk so convincingly. She talks about, because she ran an obesity clinic, and she said, I can tell you about my patients. They come in they've weighed their food. They come in with their food diaries. They're trying as hard as they can, and they are gaining weight, or they are not losing weight. As my friend said, she said, I dieted myself all the way up to 400 pounds. And so, but the blame is, I think, tragically placed on individuals who feel like they're not trying, they're told they're not exercising enough, you're not trying hard enough, you must be cheating, is sort of the message doctors give to their patients. And it is the message that is sort of out there in the media. I know now there's a campaign not to fat shame, and actually people are sort of backed off talking about obesity whatsoever. But it needs to be discussed. And it needs to be discussed in different terms, because we cannot fat shame people anymore. I mean, if we need to place blame, as Sarah said, she says, we should really be talking about our own advice, referring to herself as a doctor. So, so just to answer your question, I mean, it's very hard to, it has been very hard to make a convincing case that it is our guidelines that have been making us sick and giving us diabetes and giving us, and doing nothing, say, to prevent heart disease. But the science in the last 10 years, and this is what makes me somewhat hopeful, although not entirely, because remember that silent study, and what we're seeing is a continuation of that. But there's a huge body now of science, good, rigorous clinical trials showing that when people reduce their carbohydrates and really turn the guidelines upside down, turn the food pyramid upside down, they get healthy. So that science is currently being ignored, which is astonishing. Like, how do you ignore now 100 clinical trials? How do you ignore that science? But I will tell you that the Dietary Guideline Committee that was, published the most recent iteration, they ignored all that literature. And it was only our group who was like raising their hand to say, hey, how can you, here are the studies, how can you ignore all the studies?
Crazy.
They could only find one low carb study, and that was because one of the Dietary Guideline Committee members herself was an author on that study.
Wow. That's
crazy.
crazy.
I don't know if that's, yeah. So I think it's just much harder. It's not a simple crash of a plane. It's a long-term chronic disease, and there are, there's many ways to play the blame game. And science is not the only voice here. You have the voice of the pharmaceutical companies, the food companies. You have so many other interests that are the status quo, defending itself. So you have many other voices that are far louder and more well funded than the voice of science. What is, we can all debate science now. There's a lot of question marks about how even to judge science, I think, in our current climate. But that's why it's been very hard to have this conversation about what causes chronic disease.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's such a good point that you made about the industry and in any other science. I've heard you made this point too, where like follow the money. The money will tell you where things are going. And it's almost like we've forgotten that with nutrition science. Once you see it, it's so obvious, where the money is coming from. But it's just bizarre in nutrition that you have so much less of that, or that's kind of less apparent.
Wait, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Casey, can I interrupt you? Can
Please.
I just make one other point about that?
Please.
Because it's really important about the money. And there's just 2 points I want to make. One is that the reporters covering nutrition tend to come out, like the person at the Washington Post, she was a cookbook writer. The lead writer on nutrition, like writing on the op-ed page, was a cookbook writer. They tend to come out of the lifestyle sections or cookbooks. They're just not reporters. They haven't come off the covering, the big banks. They haven't been trained to follow the money. It's just not part of the zeitgeist of nutrition reporting, which is sort of been reporting light, L-I-T-E light. So that's part of why we don't see it. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is that I, along with some other authors, just published the first ever paper that goes through all of the financial conflicts of interest of the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee, because that committee is one of the only committees in the world that doesn't disclose their conflicts of interest. Any guideline committee has to disclose, except for this committee doesn't. And so we found that 95% of the people on the committee had at least one tie to industry, and more than half had over 20 ties to companies like Nestle, Monsanto, ILSI, which is a trade group for giant multinational food corporations. I mean, Dannon, it really is a really striking finding, and nobody's done that before. So, that's the kind of thing that we're doing to try to bring some greater transparency to this process and make people aware.
We just cannot thank Nina enough for her tireless work in this world. So much research that she's done. We're now going to go to one of her really good friends, Vinny Tortorich, who's been in the fitness industry for a very long time. He's the author of Fitness Confidential. He is actually going to back up some of the things that Nina has said and start to introduce some of these very interesting concepts. Things are going to start to get a little bit weird as he's mentioning the Seventh-day Adventist Church and how they are involved with our nutritional guidelines, which is absolutely 1,000% the case, as much as that is so weird and bizarre to believe, go back and listen to the episode that we did on Boundless Body Radio with the Fetkes, in particular Belinda Fetke, uncovering the work that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has done to create the nutritional guidelines that we're all used to. It's absolutely bananas. Such a crazy story. Vinny does a great job in this clip, and I thought it was important to include here.
I'm not that good of a storyteller. This is all real. I know people are sitting there going, "Oh, come on, who's this guy? What's he talking?" No, folks. This is real stuff.
It's crazy.
So one thing leads to another, and John Kellogg, Dr. Kellogg, he came up with dextrinization, pulling sugar from grain products and what have you, and he came up with this flake. And he was like, "Hey, if we could just get people to eat this flake, this meal, then and fill yourself up on this, you're not going to want to ever jerk off or whatever." I doubt they use the word jerk off, but they use some version of that, I'm sure. And that's how Kellogg's cornflakes is how Post cereal got started. And I could go into Post and talk about Postum and how that came about.
That's so crazy.
Yeah. All these stories are so fantastical. You'll sit around and go, "Oh, come on!" But I'm telling you, they're all true. You could go look any of this stuff up. It's all real.
Wow,
very real.
You did a great job with the scenes. Fast forwarding quite a bit, the scenes that showed like the 80s and 90s, and all the aerobics classes. And Bethany pulled up a video yesterday. The Buttmaster VHS tapes.
Oh, Buns of Steel. I did just an unapologetic amount of hours of burning those cheeseburgers is the specific line that he would use.
You talk about the food pyramid, and 6 to 11 servings of bread, rice, and pasta every single day is the recommendation. Like, how did we get to that point?
That's anyone's guess. I've been trying to figure that out for years. I added it up, the number of servings they want you to have per day. I did that in Fat One, and there was so many servings that I couldn't remember it. I had to jot it down. I just held a piece of paper in front of me on camera and read it off. And then I said at the end of it, "Great, now we know how many servings. Now we have to figure out what a serving is." Because the government does have a serving, but no one knows what it is. You could go look it up. You won't readily find it on Google, right? It's in the annals of somewhere in the country, but we don't know where that is, right?
Wow.
So it's all just very vague. And if you go back and look at the McGovern Committee study, I mean, we did a lot of that on the show, right? In Fat One. At the end, you could see where they just kind of threw their hands up and said, "I don't know, pick one." It's literally what they did. They went, "I don't know, let's just pick one. We got to move on. We spent too much time on this."
Wow.
Just pick one. "Oh, no meat. Okay, that sounds good. Moving on." And that was it.
That's ridiculous. It's so insane. I'm so glad you obviously included Nina. She's awesome in the movie. You also included Dave Feldman, which I followed his work for a very long time. I think it's really interesting that those people did not start out in the nutrition world or the medical world. You're talking to an engineer and you're talking to a journalist. And I think that brings a lot of clout to the argument that, like, this isn't just the same American Heart Association, ADA, whoever you want to name, U.S. government. These are people that think and ask questions, and they have come to some very interesting and very uncomfortable conclusions if you've been, kind of in this health world.
Yeah, Nina in particular, because her father was a scientist, and she understood science and how science works. And what people need to know about Nina was that she was vegetarian/vegan. And when she started researching this, a lot of people, research themselves correct. Well, she started researching it and realized that she was, what she was seeing did not jive with what she wanted to find out. And you got to give that woman a lot of credit, because she wanted the outcome to be vegan, right? That vegan is the best way to go. but she could not deny what she was looking at. And coming from a science background, she just simply said, I cannot deny this, and more power to her for sticking to her guns and doing what she thought was right.
So these next two clips really kind of tie everything together. I thought they were so important to include as well. We're going to go back to Dave Champion, author of Body Science. He's going to talk about a lot here. And if you can pick up everything that he's trying to convey in this clip, I applaud you. This is something that I had to re-listen to several times to be able to unpack all of the different concepts that he's going to talk about, including verifying a lot of the things we've learned already about Dr. Ansel Keys. He's going to talk about glucosis and ketosis, which is very interesting. We're going to come back to ketosis and keto in particular and what that does and why it is absolutely not a fad, regardless of whatever you're told. So again, lots of concepts here. Do not be surprised if you have to go back and listen to this multiple times.
We need to get over this societal false narrative that LDL is bad and HDL is good. We have to go back all the way to the 1950s and Ansel Keys and his bogus research that was paid for by the sugar industry, in which he came out and instead of attributing the rampant increase in heart disease across the United States to what it really came from, which was carb intake generically and sugar intake specifically, or I should say not specifically, but to a lesser extent. So we had this whole carb dynamic that the world had never known before, and that was fueling the heart disease epidemic, or what was viewed as an epidemic back in the 1950s. And so he took sugar money, and then he said, okay, so I took their money, it can't be sugar, so I have to find something else. And his research was totally bogus. One of the most outrageous stories came from one of his research assistants when he was doing research across Europe. And he would give people in these communities written questionnaires, and he would ask them to fill them out. And if the results that he got back on the questionnaires from the community did not confirm his hypothesis that he wanted to confirm because the sugar industry was paying him, he simply threw them in the trash and told his research assistants they obviously lied. No evidence that they lied, but since it was antithetical to what he wanted to say in the end, he threw them in the trash. So literally threw them in the trash. So he ended up with confirmation bias. If you want this hypothesis to be true and you throw away all the evidence that it's false, then the only evidence left is that it's true. So he did this 7 countries report, which I talk about in Body Science. And that was spread far and wide across the United States. And suddenly, and Ansel Keys had a powerful personality, and he was a huge intellect. He was corrupt as hell, but powerful personality, well-liked, well-received, came off very professional. And so he started to gain traction. Now, interestingly, he went to the American Heart Association, and he said, I want you to adopt the conclusions from the 7 Nations report. And the American Heart Association looked at it. They were like, nah, not really. Can't go there. We don't see this as credible. So Keys, being part politician, not holding public office, but he was he knew how to wrangle things politically. He actually got a seat on the board of the American Heart Association, then slowly brought his Confederates in. And when they had enough votes, they then had the American Heart Association vote to adopt his principles, right? Wow. Which were completely bogus. And starting in 1980, the United States government then adopted them. And of course, whenever the government speaks, everybody says, well, that must be gospel. Right. So once the United States government adopted what had originated as Keys's bogus conclusions, it was all over but the shouting. Americans started dropping red meat. They started dropping saturated fat intake. They started increasing all sorts of other things. But I think more importantly, the big damage here is the emphasis was taken completely away from carbs generally and more pointedly sugar, which is exactly what Keys was paid to do and did. I have to give him credit. He did a fantastic job of misleading an entire country and, in fact, to a lesser extent, the world.
Wow. Yeah, it's so crazy. I mean, if this would have happened in any other industry, if somebody would have been developing brakes for a truck or something, and the brakes were shown to be faulty in their testing, and an employee just threw some of the records away, like there would be a riot on the street. Like there's like, it seems no other industry that this could be allowed to happen. It's so bananas. It's almost unbelievable. It's crazy.
Yes, and
Wow.
of course, as you know from having read Body Science, in chapter 13, I talk about the economic consequences. And it is those economic consequences which involve trillion-dollar industries, which is why, despite you and I knowing all of this information and you and I living it out, most Americans, I'm going to guess more than 95% of Americans don't know anything that we're talking about today.
That's right.
The reason is the establishment, which to a great extent is the government, and to a lesser extent, a number of universities and research institutions. The establishment has a complete funding blackout on ketosis. And that complete funding blackout confirms they already know what the results would be, because we spend literally trillions of dollars on medical and nutritional research, except on this one area where there is zero research. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so crazy. Wow. Yeah. That chapter with the financial implications, like I knew that, obviously finances are involved. And if everybody starts eating this way, nobody makes a lot of money on people, but to actually see the totals that you have in that chapter were absolutely staggering. It's so crazy. So, okay, so we have glucosis, we have ketosis, we've got cholesterol, which everybody knows, comes from food and is bad. Generally speaking, if you have too much of it, we've got LDL and HDL, which are lipoproteins, like you mentioned, and tell me if this is a good way to think about it. The cholesterol, when we talk about cholesterol, there's no such thing as good or bad. It's just cholesterol. What we're talking about when we say, LDL is bad, HDL is good, which isn't true, like you said, is it's more like the fats and lipids and cholesterols can't really move through the blood very easily because they're hydrophobic. They don't swim. So they need some type of transportation system to carry that essential nutrient, which is cholesterol, out to the body or bring it back to the liver. Is that an okay way to say it? It's almost like passengers inside a car.
Very much so. I think, though, it's important to clarify or add additional framework that the cells themselves, almost every cell in the body, there are a few exceptions, but almost every cell in the body produces its own cholesterol.
Yep.
Right. So what you and I are talking about now, when we're talking about the delivery vehicle, we're talking about the conversion that takes place in the liver when the body has to go into the emergency oh shit mode and get rid of all the high blood glucose. The liver then converts the glucose into triglycerides. Again, as you said, triglyceride is a fatty acid and it's hydrophobic, and it can't play well with water at all. So it's packaged inside this container, as you said, the LDL, and then the liver starts spitting them out by the literally the trillions into the blood. So that's where blood-borne cholesterol, we find it. That is not, which is not the same as the cholesterol that's self-produced by virtually every cell in the body.
Yeah, I think.
And obviously, the cell is self-produced in the cells. The cholesterol self-produced in the cells is. There would never ever be a question if that was harmful.
Right, and it's
the stuff circulating in the blood where we go, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, because you would think if I eat cholesterol is going to get inside me, it's going to get right into the bloodstream, and that's going to clog my arteries. And I think that's a really simplistic way of thinking about this. What you are explaining sounds like the hepatic lipid system, which you talk about in the book. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that is and what that means?
Sure. Hepatic is a medical indicator for liver function. And one of the things I found, this is somewhat like having to name glucoses because the medical community had not. One of the things that I found is the system that I started to talk about, where the body goes into the emergency mode and has to clear high blood glucose out of the blood, because that's high blood glucose is very damaging to the tissues of the body. So when it does that, it has a couple of mechanisms to do that, but the primary one, and the one that the medical industry mischaracterizes, as far as that it's bad for you. And it is if you're living glucose. So let me be clear. So the blood goes through the liver strips the glucose out, the liver converts it to triglycerides, packages it in LDL, and sends it out. That's the short version. Then LDLs, they end up as IDL and VLDL, which those two fall into the category of remnant cholesterol, which we can talk about on another occasion, which is actually the gold standard. Remnant cholesterol is the gold standard for whether or not you're in glucosis and have a health problem. So anyway, so we've got this hepatic system that strips the glucose out of the blood and puts this LDL into the blood. Now, you had Dave Feldman on. I don't know if you guys talked about triglycerides, but Dave Feldman has an awesome character. His background is actually as an engineer.
That's right.
So he has a great perspective on triglycerides as packaged in LDL through the hepatic lipid system, which we're discussing. And he says quite correctly, when he phrased it this way, it was like, wow, I love this. He said, from an engineering perspective, there's absolutely no reason that energy should be stored in the blood.
Mm.
Okay. And that's exactly what happens with the hepatic lipid system, with the glucose being converted into triglycerides stashed inside LDL particles and then spit out of the liver into the bloodstream. That is exactly what's happening. It is being stored in the blood until it then can be stored in the adipose tissue, which is commonly known as body fat. And not the visceral kind on the inside, the kind you can see on the outside. In this whole system that we're describing, where you've got the highly elevated glucose, it goes into the liver strips it out, converts it to triglycerides, packages it in LDLs, spits all the LDLs out. The LDLs eventually have to get rid of the triglycerides. They do that with by putting it in the adipose cells and so forth. This whole process that you and I just are kicking around did not have a name. It's a very quantifiable series of events that begin with X and end with Z, right? And yet the medical community had never given it a name. And again, I question, as you know from reading the book, is there some improper reason that these things have never been named? Because how do you talk about them if you can't name them?
That's right.
So I had to come up with a name where we go from the beginning point to the ending point of this process. And the name I came up with, because it relies on the liver, it is a liver-driven operation, is the hepatic lipid system. It takes glucose and turns it into lipids that should not be in your body.
Mm. And this is the emergency backup that should run very occasionally, not to be throttled all the time, correct?
Absolutely. If we go back, we'll just go back 20,000 years ago to ancient man, before the first agricultural revolution and so forth. Man ate overwhelmingly animal flesh, and the occasions when he could have gotten enough carb-heavy foods where his glucose would rise anything more than a trivial amount was almost unheard of. It was almost never in an entire lifetime. It was almost never. However, if he did come across something and he was able, ancient man was able to drive his glucose level up to some, what today would be minor levels, but in his world would have been an extraordinarily high level, the hepatic lipid system would have been part of the equation that the body used to bring his numbers back into balance again.
Mm. Gotcha. So let's contrast that. So we talked about the hepatic lipid system. In that state, let's go back 20,000 years, in the state that we assume that man was probably in ketosis all of the time. Can you tell us a little bit about the lymphatic lipid system and the difference between those two?
Okay, let me start with, yes, I had to name this one too.
Glad you did.
Because once again, this entire process from the minute that any fatty acids, which would be dietary fat, any fatty acids that hit your intestines, and what happens from that moment all the way to the point where a cell oxidizes that fatty acid as energy. That whole process from A to Z didn't, again, have a name. So now it does, the lymphatic lipid system. And the reason that I named it the lymphatic system is the initial path from the fatty acids that are emulsified in the intestines that then end up being incorporated into something called a chylomicron, which then only in that form can it transit the intestinal wall. Once it transits the intestinal wall, unlike other substances that go directly into the blood, the chylomicrons go into the lymphatic system. And most people, they've heard of like a lymph node, but beyond that, they really they're not aware of the word lymph, like what it means, what it is. They may have heard that they have something called a lymphatic system. So this is how crucial it is. It takes fatty acids and it brings them up through the portal and then drops them out just above the heart into the aorta. So that's where now these fatty acids, much like the triglycerides produced by the liver in the hepatic lipid system, have to ride inside the LDL container. Likewise, the fatty acids that come out of the lymphatic portal, they also are hydrophobic. They also have to ride inside a container, and that container is the chylomicron. So they travel throughout the body. Now, this is unlike the hepatic lipid system, which produces incredibly unhealthy results for the average human being, well, for all human beings. The lymphatic lipid system is exactly how our bodies are intended to operate. So the chylomicron, it flows through the blood, and then there's a ApoB100, which is, I'm not going to get into all that. That's the sciencey part. We'd be here all day. It basically, if you consider the chylomicron as a delivery truck, and when it leaves the factory, the back door is locked. And so what happens is the HDL that's floating around in the blood links up with the chylomicron, and it transmits, it loans an enzyme, and the enzyme unlocks the cargo door of the chylomicron. Okay, so I mean, the body is just an amazing thing, and then Incredible. It gives that enzyme, gives that enzyme back to the HDL lipid. So then it goes along, and the chylomicron links up with each cell that needs energy, and it transfers the fatty acids into the cell, and the cells use the fatty acids, they oxidize it for energy. Now, I think the really important point to make is this. I said earlier that the long-standing false establishment narrative is that glucose is the way that the body is to create, that the cells are to create energy. It is the proper, right, and normal way, and everything else is some sort of fluke that is completely 180 degrees opposed to reality. The cells oxidizing glucose is part of that emergency system to reduce the amount of blood glucose, to bring down the blood glucose level. Okay? It's part of that system. The liver cannot handle it all, so insulin signals the cells to open up and take in the glucose to get it out of the blood. And of course, the research narrative is, well, yeah, we want the glucose in the cells. No, it's an emergency mechanism. There is no benefit to running in the emergency mode 24/7 your entire life. It actually breaks down the body's systems. Conversely, the lymphatic lipid system, it delivers only fatty acids. So here's the deal. We've got the one hemisphere, glucosis, where the cells burn glucose. We've got the other hemisphere, ketosis, burning primarily fatty acids and to a lesser extent ketones. Burning glucose is like putting diesel in a Maserati engine. Okay? And burning fatty acids is like putting high octane fuel in your Maserati engine. And somehow the establishment has gotten this completely backwards. And they want to claim that pumping diesel into the gas tank of your Maserati, oh, hell yeah, that's totally normal. Let's do a whole bunch more of that. It's so apparent. You've read Body Science, so you get it. But it's so apparent that that's nonsense. It is literally mind-boggling that a gigantic percentage of the civilized world actually believes that nonsense.
Wow. That's so crazy. Okay, so let's just quickly recap. So in the lymphatic lipid system, this is the system that is designed to run efficiently pretty much all of the time. So if I am eating primarily animal flesh, I'm consuming proteins and fats, preferring the fats for energy. Those come into my body. They do not go directly into the bloodstream. They go through the lymphatic system, into a chylomicron, and they get distributed for energy, which is to be burned, not to be stored. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Not one single bit of the fatty acids that are delivered through the lymphatic lipid system are stored. None. Zero.
Okay. Then I am out in the world. Occasionally I will come across some fruit, maybe some honey, something that is carbohydrate based. That's going to be pretty rare because I'm competing with other animals, which I love that you made that point in the book. Birds probably are going to access those fruits way better than I'm going to be able to. Those foods are pretty much seasonal unless you live in very specific parts of the world. You're probably not going to see them all the time. And they're very different from the fruits and whatever, carbohydrate foods we think of today. They were vastly different back then. Is that, are we good so far?
Absolutely. Fruits and vegetables that we walk into the grocery store and look at today and readily identify, we would have no idea what the hell we were looking at 25,000 years ago.
Softball-sized apples, like you can buy in May. It's absurd, and most people never stop to consider it because that's their normal. That's what they've grown up with.
Yeah, there's been a lot of hybrid breeding that has made things much more desirable from a consumer perspective over the last 100 years or so.
Gotcha. Okay, so ancient man, again, he's living mostly in ketosis, eating lots of proteins and fats, probably doesn't need to eat very frequently because he is running on those ketones, using them for fuel, not storing them. Occasionally he has something maybe that's a little sweeter, carbohydrate-based, he'll eat that. Hepatic lipid system kicks on, deals with this rare occasion, that doesn't happen very often, and sorts out the problem as an emergency mechanism. And we can go back to living primarily in ketosis, pretty healthy and happy, and continue down that path. And we've done that for tens and hundreds of thousands of years. Is that correct so far?
Yes, I do want to highlight one point where you talk about, okay, so he stumbles across some stuff that's sugary or high carb, and the hepatic lipid system kicks in to resolve that. And then he never does leave ketosis, by the way, when that happens, because it's such a momentary event that it doesn't change his physiology. His cells still only want fatty acids. It takes some period of days in order to flip back. Okay, but the important point I want to make here is that incident, he stumbles across, we'll use honey because since you mentioned that, although that tends to be more of a fructose issue, but nevertheless, we'll use that as an example. And so his blood glucose goes up, the hepatic lipid system kicks in and resolves that. That did zero damage to his body. Now, the reason I bring that up is what the standard American diet does, and what vast majority of Americans and probably people in the Western world generally do, is they require that emergency hepatic lipid system. They require that to run every single day, multiple times a day. It is the norm, this emergency system that man's genetic coding intended to have used once in a blue moon. They make it run constantly for their entire lives. And then the body gets worn down by that. And finally, by the time you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, on comes the chronic disease. And that really is a manifestation that the body simply cannot cope with the ongoing abuse any longer.
Thank you so very much for listening to this special episode taken from the Boundless Body Radio Premium Podcast. If you haven't already, please follow our show on Apple Podcasts and be sure to leave us a rating and review on that platform, as it is the best way to continue to get our message out to new people all over the world. And as we said in the introduction, feel free to book a 30-minute complimentary session with us on our website at myboundlessbody.com so we can discuss your health and fitness goals and help you come up with a plan. Thank you so very much, as always, for listening to Boundless Body Radio.